For this mock exercise, we're going to go through more practice regarding to the reporting and analyzing receivables. We're going to work on Yukon Corporation. We're going to work on an aging schedule this time, preparing some journal entries, and maybe also commenting on the direction of the bad debts that are going. Okay, so let's take a look at a question together here. So if we take a look at the question, they've given you an aging schedule. An aging schedule basically represents different buckets of timing. So in this case here, they're saying to you that in 2013, out of the $380,000 worth of receivables, $220,000 is coming from 0 to 30 days that are outstanding. And then 31 to 60 days outstanding is $86,000. 60 to 90 days that are outstanding is $52,000. And over 90 days is $22,000. So obviously, the longer the aging, the more risk you're going to have in collecting them, and the higher potential you should provide for those risk of collecting them. So you can see the percentages of uncollectibles is much higher as you go through the aging bucket. So in 2014 is the same thing. They have a total of $440,000 in the receivables broken down in various different buckets. Then they said to you that at December 31st, 2013, the unadjusted balance in allowance for doubtful accounts was a credit of $3,000. And they also tell you in 2014, $28,000 of the accounts were written off as uncollectible, and $3,000 worth of the accounts receivables that were previously written off and they were now recovering it. So the first thing they would like you to do is to do an aging schedule to come up with what should be the amount they should provide for the uncollectibles at the end of 2013 and 2014, and ask you to also comment on the results. The other thing is they wanted to do the adjusting entry regarding to the bad debts on December 31st, 2013. They then wanted to record the write-off uncollectible in 2014 and record also the collection in 2014. They wanted to do the adjusting entry related to the bad debt expense in 2014, come up with a net realizable value of receivables for 2013 and 2014, and they ask you whether you think Yukon was conservative when estimating the bad debt expense, and ask you to explain it. Okay, so let's take a look at the question together here. So to start with, I have restated the formality of my aging schedule because I wanted to figure out how much is the amount that I needed to provide for at the end of 2013 and 2014 for the bad debts. So I'm restating my aging schedule in a slightly different way. So I put all the aging buckets on the top here, and then the calculation at the bottom here. So let's start with 2013. As you can tell from here, my total receivable is $380,000, but these are the aging I should put into my receivables. So I'm just going to put these numbers into here. So it's $220,000 here. And over here I have $140,000. I'm sorry, I have actually $86,000 here. And over here I have $52,000, which is 61 to 90 days. And then over 90 days, I actually have $22,000 with the total receivables of $380,000, which is my total, which is a total of all these things, which should add up to the same amount here. And then if I need to calculate my estimated bad debts, I would take $220,000 that I have in the receivables for 0 to 30 days. And currently, I'm estimating 3% chance I would not be able to collect them. So I'm going to take 220 times the 3% to come up with $6,600. And I'll do the same thing for each of those buckets. So my total would be ended up with excuse me. $22,400. This is what I would need it to come up with. Okay, I would be doing the same thing for 2014. So I would again copy from what I've got earlier. And again, I would do the same thing for the estimation. So these are the two amounts that I would need it to provide at the end of each of those years relative to my allowance for bad debt. Because those are the amounts that I estimated that I may not be able to collect for each of those 2 years. So the question asked you is to comment on the aging of these things here. As you can see that because the receivables have gone up for each of those for the second year for 2014, as a result of that, the bad debt has also gone up because of the increase in the receivables. There's not one particular bucket that has gone up quite drastically. It seems like there's a sort of a considerable amount of increase for each of those buckets. So basically, the increase has been quite spread out across all the different buckets. But the increase in allowance definitely can be contributed to the based on the increase in the receivables. Now, the second question they ask you is to ask you to prepare the journal entries for 2013 to account for this bad debt allowance. As we can tell in the question, they did tell you that the allowance before the adjustment in 2013 is $3,000. So if we take a look at the allowance, the unadjusted allowance, that's $3,000, and what we needed is so the required allowance you needed to put it in is $22,400. So that means that I need to provide for the bad debt of the difference of those two, which is $19,400. And they ask you to make a journal entry regarding to this, so I would debit the bad debt expense and crediting the allowance for doubtful accounts for $19,400. Just moving on, they ask you to record the write-off of uncollectible in 2014 and also the recovery. So in the question, they've mentioned that $28,000 in 2014 were written off. So when you're writing off the allowance, you would have to debit the allowance for doubtful accounts. And the amount is $28,000. And then you would need to credit the accounts receivables. And then the recovery, they have got $3,000 worth of recovery. So what you have to do is to reverse the entry you have written off earlier. So you would debit the allowance, the accounts receivables of $3,000, and you would credit the allowance for doubtful accounts for $3,000. And then you would then debit cash for $3,000. because that's how much you have now collected, and crediting the accounts receivables for $3,000 to account for that difference. Then they ask you to prepare the adjusting entry related to the bad debt on December 31st, 2014. Okay, so to do that, the first thing you needed to do is to figure out what is my adjusting entry at the end of the period that I'm actually working with in this particular case, and then what are the things I needed to work out. So we know that the end of December balance, so my December 31st, 2013 balance I know that my December 31st, 2013 balance, I should have a total of $22,400. And I need to, and normally speaking, I would need to come up with the amount that I need to put in that would be increased by the amount of bad debt expense I need to account for the current year, for 2014. And during that year, I have used up the write-off, which will reduce the amount of allowance. And then I would be increasing the allowance by the recovery and that would be equals to my ending balance of December 31st, 2014. So if I go by this equation here, my bad debt expense is something that I would need to work it out because I wanted to know how much I needed to provide for so I can bring from $22,400 to the ending balance of what I've got now here of $27,680, because this is the allowance that I estimated I should have at the end of the period. And then I needed to, and I recognized the fact that during 2014, I've actually written off $28,000 worth of allowance, and then I actually recover $3,000 come out of the allowance. So in order to calculate the bad debt expense, so that would be based on $27,680 minus the $3,000. You add back the $28,000. And you subtracted the $22,400. So my bad debt expense should be equals to basically it should be equals to $30,280. So the entry to record this will now be debit the bad debt expense, $32.80, and crediting the allowance for doubtful accounts for $32.80. And then the next question they ask you is, what is the net realizable value for the Yukon's receivables for 2013 and 2014? So let's take a look at the net realizable value. So we have the accounts receivables. We subtracted the allowance for doubtful accounts for each of those years. So if I put 2013 and 2014 here, okay, so we have the receivables total, as we can see from the aging schedule. For 2013, my total is $380,000. And for 2014, according to my aging schedule, I should have $440,000. And then we know the allowance that we needed to provide here. is I have the allowance of $22,400 in this year, and the allowance I needed to provide for this year is $27,680, which is also coming from the aging schedule. So the net realizable value would be the difference of those, right? In this case would be $357,600 in 2013, and in this case it would be $412,320. And the last question they ask you is, do you think Yukon was conservative in estimating the bad debt expense? If you take a look at 2014, if we would take a look at the 2013 and 2014, if we take a look at 2013 in the ending allowance, we have a total of $22,400. But in 2014, our actual write-off was actually $25,000, as you can tell from here, if you netted out the recovery. So basically speaking, the answer has to be no. It's not very conservative because they only provided for $22,400 to go into 2014, and they actually ended up needing $25,000 here for 2014. So they should be a little bit more aggressive, probably in their estimates, to come up with the allowance. This now concludes the question, and thank you.